What are some key lessons that you coach people to improve at their listening?
Yeah, keep in mind most people, 86% of people are at level 1 or level 2. And the aspiration for level 5 is like a kind of social runner who runs park runs wanting to do a marathon. You know, only half of 1% of the Earth's population has ever run a marathon, and that takes a high level of commitment. Having run 6 myself and feeling long-term injuries as a result of it, I can understand. When we're at level 2, one of the things I really want people to become conscious of is, are they listening to reload their argument, or are they listening to help the speaker make sense of what they're thinking? So for many of us, we think we need to understand everything the speaker is saying. And yet, one of the things we can be really helpful with at level 2 is to start to notice some patterns in the way the speaker is explaining a problem. Now, all the research I've done, James, is in the workplace, so the examples I'll give accordingly are in the workplace as well. So a really simple example of this is a client of mine was telling me about a situation, and they met up with a peer, and they said to the peer, "I'm really struggling with my boss." Now, they hadn't finished what they were about to say, and the other person said, "Oh, you think you've got a bad boss? Let me tell you about the worst boss I ever had." And they spent the next 20 minutes dumping on this other person about the boss. Now, what that person in that moment wanted the listener to do was actually to listen and not to solve or not to compare. So at level 2, one of the first things we want to do is help the speaker make a little bit of sense of the patterns that they're talking about. So when you're listening at level 2, I encourage you to notice, do people talk about mainly the past? Do they talk mainly about the present or the future? Do they speak about themselves, or do they speak about the team or others? Are they mainly internally orientated, or are they mainly externally oriented? Do they speak in stats, or do they speak in stories? Do they speak in details, or do they speak in big pictures? Now, the reason we want you at level 2 to start to notice how the other person speaks is that you can start to match the way they speak. So imagine I'm a very elaborate storyteller. I love the whiteboard and drawing on the whiteboard. If you continue to talk to this person only with deep, sequential, rational details, there's going to be a mismatch in the way you are speaking and listening to each other. So you need to dial into their stories and tell them how what you're trying to say to them is relevant. So for many of us, we don't even know the adjectives people use, the pronouns that people use, the nouns or the verbs that people use. Picture this is a phrase that somebody would love to tell a story, is about to set you up with. So your job is not to cut their story off mid-sentence, is to let them finish. Where somebody says to you, "It really sounds like we've got an issue here." These people have a preference around auditory and usually about detail. So when you're listening here at level 2, you want to notice how people are expressing themselves, not what they say. That's important, but also how they're saying it. And when you do, they feel more comfortable because they can relax into their normal styles. Now, particularly when you're early on in your career, this is something that you go, "Oh, this is difficult enough. I'm trying to learn my profession. I'm trying to learn the organisation. And now you're telling me to learn to listen to the way my manager is speaking." If you do, your likelihood to get promoted is much higher. The likelihood they're going to trust you with more interesting and complex projects is much higher. The likelihood you're going to be working on projects that have more senior visibility is much higher. The difference, I rebuilt the graduate program at Microsoft, by the way. I didn't mention that to you, James, and it got exported to 26 Microsoft subsidiaries around the world in my time there. So I got a really big focus on next generation leaders. And what separated people who moved from graduate to higher roles in Microsoft wasn't their technical skill. It was their communication effectiveness. So if you do want these, this is a superpower you can build, and you'll accelerate your career more if you're perceived as a better listener.
Yeah, I think that's really true. Really. With regard to the communication stuff, I think it's all and good to work on your speaking, your writing, and I think that is really important. But this listening is something that almost maybe people haven't even considered. Improving listening as part of that really whole portfolio of communication skills, and something that you can really work on. And I think those tips you gave there, whether it's paying attention to your boss more closely, paying attention to how they say things, not just what they say. All of these things are really fundamental to, growing that whole better communication skill set. And I think that's really interesting, that the communication is really something that's driving your role in the organization rather than your actual technical skill. Because definitely I've found that in my own workplace, once you know your technical role, that's good. But once you get up to leading the team, even, which is almost like the next step, really, your communication then becomes really important.